Howdy. When we talk about the will, we tend to talk about things in a bipolar way. On one extreme, we talk about the libido. It's this inner psychic energy that we're born with that maybe comes from unlocking unconscious material and then forces us or brings us to act out into the world. On the other extreme, we might talk about behavioral reinforcement, that we engage in a particular behavior or action because there is some sort of consequence that is reinforcing of that behavior. Either side of that polarity can be helpful in us examining our behavior from a different perspective. And yet I am reluctant to fall on either side. And that's because both tend to reduce or remove that sense of human agency, that I can choose something and do something. Because when I think about will, the will to action, willpower, I think about this as being an intentional, focused exertion of energy into action. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the things that bring about or elicit our will, the different types of will we have, and some of those barriers to experiencing it. Now, before we get into this anymore, I want to make sure that I address that will, or the will, is something that seems kind of outdated in our modern society. Now, there are many different reasons that that might be the case, that it feels outdated. One of them being epistemologically or philosophically, the way that we look at the world and understand the world has shifted considerably over the past couple centuries. And so where people have talked about willpower in the past, we may frame it a little bit differently today. Right in the 1960s, Rollo May was exploring how the will has maybe been challenged by some ways of viewing the world. And in particular, he pulled out two theorists, Freud and Marx, as being hugely influential in disrupting our understanding of the will. With Freud, we're talking about those internal reasons or motivations for particular actions being questionable because of defense mechanisms. If I'm projecting or if I'm denying or repressing particular content, I might be acting out of those defense mechanisms instead of my own particular values or ideals or how I want to be in the world. And for Marx, we're thinking about living within a society that is perpetuating certain social structures, and that we wonder then, are we making decisions based upon intrinsic motivations or because of the systems that we live within? And so from that perspective, we're saying we don't know if we're choosing or acting because of what's inside of us or what's outside of us, and so we all of a sudden lose human agency. And while this may seem very dated, I'm talking about someone writing in the 1960s about people who were writing in the turn of the last century and even earlier than that. And when we pull this forward to our modern discourse, particularly around critical theory, we see at the center of that the disruptive thoughts of Freud and Marx, both dislocating our motivation internally and our motivation externally. And so even those dated concepts come back to us today to say, are we certain, are we confident that when we make decisions, they are our own? So can we actually will things based upon our unique experience? And if not, is there any utility to willing? And right there, these are big philosophical questions that are worth exploration, consideration, and reflection in our own lives. And we still got to do something, right? Because climate change, social unrest, racism, sexism, heterosexism, all this stuff exists in the systems in which we live. And so enter the will. It's not to minimize the systems in which we live, the systems of oppression, and we don't want to minimize human agency. And I think there's an important question about who are we? That in exerting our will, we are actively making a decision. We are expressing a preference. We are expressing a viewpoint. And in doing so, reflecting who we are as people. Roberto Sigioli, the Italian analyst and founder of psychosynthesis, wrote quite a bit about the will. And he talked about it's catalyzed in a couple of different ways. He said, when we experience a crisis, we're called to action. We're thrust into a moment where we're challenged and we meet that challenge. We will to it. I think about the moments where I'm trying to fix something on the sink and all of a sudden water's spraying all over the kitchen and I jump into action. My will to act is heightened. I'm sharp, I'm focused, I'm freaking out, but I'm doing. He said we also catalyze our will through that inner reflection. When we're spending time with ourselves and exploring what's inside of us, we might find that there's a voice or a part of us that starts to speak, start to pull us into something new. And in those quiet voices or quiet spaces, we might find a call to create, maybe art or music. It also might be in those spaces that we start to truly or deeply hear another person's suffering or experience, which again calls us out into the world and into action. And the third way is through kind of common everyday struggles. We come in conflict with the world. There's always a rough edge, and rough edges, we don't want them, but rough edges are so important to shaping us, to challenging us, to helping us grow. And when we experience those rough edges, we find that we have a preference, we have a perspective, and that we want to assert something into that environment. And so as the will starts to emerge, we find that there are different ways that this can look. We have the strong will, which is kind of this old school, like we're pushing through things. So it's like me deciding to exercise. And my strong will says, I'm going to exercise every morning at 6 a.m. I'm going to exercise from 6 to 7 at the gym. I'm going to go to the gym in the morning, and I'm going to be there, and I'm going to do these things. That's my strong will. I'm tired. I don't want to do this. It's very awkward and uncomfortable, and I have to cancel things. Strong will through this. The second type of will is the flexible will. And this is much more adaptive, and we kind of move and flex with what's going on. So using that exercise example, instead of choosing that time, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to add this to my morning routine. I already wake up at this time, and now I'm going to shift it, so I'm going to have 20 minutes to do some yoga in the morning. And then I'm also going to have 20 minutes at lunch in order to do a little more yoga, for example. And so I'm adding these things at pre-existing time points that will ease me into this process. The third type is the good will, which is values focused. This is when we make decisions based upon our priorities, upon our principles. This is largely in line with Viktor Frankl's will to meaning, where we center and prioritize our meaning, purpose, identity in the choices that we make. The will to meaning is an interesting concept because what he's talking about is choosing an action that is directed towards a meaningful pursuit. When we replace meaning with maybe outcomes like pleasure, money, power, that's when we start to run into emotional difficulties, or what Frankl referred to as an existential vacuum, that we have a sense of meaninglessness. For example, if I am willing towards a meaningful relationship, then I might experience sexual pleasure as a result of that. If I will towards sexual pleasure, I'm probably not going to find a meaningful relationship in that. To continue the example of exercise, the goodwill might be me expressing a value around family. That I want to show up and be healthy for my family, therefore exercise is an important component of that. So I start to will towards being healthy for my family. The fourth type is the transpersonal will. And this is when we experience something inside, kind of calling us forward. This could be considered spirit, soul, identity, personhood, whatever it is, there's something in us that just needs to be expressed. Rollo May certainly talked about this part of us. Post-Jungians like James Hillman talk about parts like this inner part that just needs expression in the world. And I guess to keep this application around exercise going, when we think about the transpersonal will, we might find that someone feels called into the world in a sport, to play soccer, play volleyball, to play basketball. And so exercise is an extension of that. They are out on the court and they are in the gym exercising and running. They might not be an NBA player, but they might be in a pickup league where they play games throughout the week. That has a sense of meaning. They are now willing into the world in that manner. Ultimately, our will comes out in a lot of different ways. But we also experience these barriers to expressing it or bringing it into the world, where we might feel like our will is limited. Acigioli talked about some barriers to expressing the will. The first being that we have these kind of outdated notions, that we think we're just supposed to push through things, that we're just supposed to ignore everything and just get it done. And that doesn't always work. The second is inertia, that if we don't exercise our will, it can kind of get stuck in a rut, and we have to get some momentum going in order to get moving again. Another barrier is what Albert Ellis would refer to as an irrational belief, that we oftentimes think that we should be good at things, or that things should work out easily for us, or that we should be able to do things perfectly, when that's rarely the case. The final barrier that I'd like to address here is thinking about how so often when we set a goal for ourselves, we set really big goals. And then when we don't meet those goals, we shame ourselves and think that we're just not able to do things. So for example, rather than saying, I'm going to exercise for 5 minutes, I say, I'm going to exercise 5 times in the next week for an hour each time. You can tell from my smile that it's like, that's a lot, right? That's too much to start with. And because then we don't meet that 5 times a day for an hour each time, like, I'm not a person who can do that. I can't exercise. But when we're working on igniting or kindling our will, we need to make sure we start small. And that's my encouragement here, is we start exercising our will in order to strengthen it in our lives. So I challenge you, start with something small, something in your control, something that's time limited and largely inconsequential. Exercise your will. Do it after this video. Watch this and then go do something. So do something maybe small, inconsequential, easy. So get up and go take a cold shower. Maybe take your shoes and socks off and walk in the snow for 30 seconds. Maybe cut up a lemon, pop a piece in your mouth. This hopefully won't hurt you. It'll maybe feel a little uncomfortable and it'll show you that you can do something. Again, small, time limited, inconsequential. I smile because I remember assiduously writing about, stand up on a chair and recite something. And it's just kind of fun to think about, well, just do something. Start to feel that you are a person who can do things. Because you are. And we live in a time where people need to do things. We need it as a society. And so find that goodwill inside of yourself, your values, and find in what ways can you bring them out through action and become a person who wills into the world. With that, I really appreciate you watching this. Thanks so much.